Hey guys, today I'm going to go over question 2 from your 11 of May quiz. The second question was actually, I think you guys thought it was a pretty easy question, and it was, but you guys made a mistake that would earn you partially correct instead of essentially correct. So I'm going to go over some of them, like some of the common mistakes. So I think you guys knew how to do this problem. That wasn't the problem, but I think like how to write the answer so that you can get full credit is more of a problem here. So part A, everybody did correctly for the most part. I think some of you misread some of the numbers, and so you made a little algebraic mistake, but usually when that happens, the AP reader usually take points off from the first one, but then they look at part B and part C using the incorrect number. So you're not gonna like bomb the test. It's just going to be not 4. So part A, I think almost none of you indicated that it was normally distributed. And I know the reason you didn't mention it is because in the problem it said normally distributed. But the problem with the AP statistics test is that it doesn't matter if your information is in the problem, if you don't restate it, if you don't write it out in your answer, they don't think that you understood the problem, or they assume that you don't know how to use that piece of information, so then they don't give you any point for that. So for the actual answer, they kind of wrote it out. They said, so another thing is that you didn't define what your x is. So some of you use like something like p of x is greater than 291.2, but how do I know what x is if you never defined it, right? And so the first problem is that you never define your variable, and every time you use a variable, you should be defining them. And then second thing is that you were able to use the information that was given by the problem, but you didn't state it again, so then you lose point. So like you can see from the scoring guide, like that indicates the distribution is normal. Like it seems silly because they said that in the question, but again, it is one of the criteria that they check as they give you scores. So you don't have to write it out, like since D is a normally distributed with a mean of da-da-da-da, you can just write n and 288, comma 2.8, because this is how you write the normal distribution, right? And so if you wrote that little symbol, you would have gotten an E for part A. And unfortunately, I think only one person really wrote it out and nobody else did. And so that was a problem. So a lot of you got a P for part A, which is very unfortunate because your calculation was all correct. I also want you to focus on how they write the equation, because obviously you could write it on a piece of paper and take a picture and upload it, but that takes a longer time. So they recommend that you get familiar with just like typing your answers, including the equations. So I told you to write it as how you would write it in a calculator. So on the calculator, you will have to put the parentheses around 291.2 minus 288, or else what it's going to do is that 291.2 minus 288 divided by 2.8. So you want to make sure that the numerator is a one thing instead of just like a two separate things. I think there were some of you who used normal CDF and wrote it out. The command for the calculator input, but remember, I think that's not the best way to write it, especially this year, because they said the test is doable without those fancy calculator. And if you think about it, normal CDF wouldn't be a function that would be on the calculator, like a scientific calculator. So I think learning how to write your answer like this is the best way to tackle this kind of question, even if you use a normal CDF function on the actual test to get your answer. Okay, I'm just saying that I don't think they will necessarily prefer the answer when they said that you don't need a fancy calculator to do this kind of exam. So that was the only thing from part A. So let's look at part B. So part B was asking, assume the mean distance traveled is 288 yards and that 5 balls are independently tested, what is the probability that at least one of the 5 balls will exceed the maximum distance of 291.2 yards? Okay, so this one, you actually had to indicate that this was a binomial distribution, right? So again, just like how you should have written the normal distribution for the part A, you should have clearly stated that the binomial distribution, so you can write it as B, 5 comma, the probability, which you got it from the above, the part A. So obviously, if you have an incorrect probability for part A, you're going to have a different answer. But again, you're not going to be penalized again. So you can write it like this, or you can, I think one student actually checked each of the conditions. So is this independent? Does the probability hold for each trial? I think success and failure condition. So that's great. That's great. But this one, and I think because you never know for sure whether they want the conditions or just like indicating that this is a binomial distribution, that I think it's always safe. And especially if you have time to write it all out, to write out some conditions and check to make sure that what you are using is a valid distribution for this question. And so I think some of the mistakes I saw was like understanding at least one, right? So some of you just found that at least one distance is greater than 291.2, and then you found that was your answer, when in fact you should have done 1 minus P of all 5 distance is less than 291.2. So this will be probability of Q, right? That's why probability of success was 0.1271, and so it would have been easier to do 1 minus probability of success happening all 5 times, because the combination for that one will be just 1. So the answer is 49.32%. Okay, so part C is asking if the manufacturer wants to be 99% certain that a randomly selected ball will not exceed the maximum distance of 291.2 yards, what is the largest mean that can be used in the manufacturing process? So I think this question, I don't know if the answer is wrong, because I can see why a lot of you solved it the way you did now that I look at the problem. So this wording right here, 99% certain, that sounds like a confidence interval, right? But then if you look at the answer, they said 99th percentile, which is a totally different meaning, because 99th percentile means that you are right here, and below you, there are 99% of the population. Whereas 99% certain, that sounds like you should have like 99% as a confidence interval. So a lot of you wrote 2.59 as and so instead of 2.33, you wrote 2.958, I think, and then solved the question. So that's why you earned P instead of E. I think this is just, yeah, I think I would have gotten this problem wrong as well, just because how the wording is. That's very interesting. Let me show you how the partially correct and the incorrect answer looks like in the answer key. So it says, set up an appropriate equation using the correct minimum distance but provides a incorrect mean because an incorrect upper tail percentile, say the 99. So this is what you guys did for the most part, but I think this one really is not a great question because they didn't use the word percentile. Like I see why you guys got this one wrong. It says 99% certain. 99% certain that a randomly selected ball will not exceed the maximum distance of 291.2 yards. Yeah, no, I'm going to ask some of the other AP Stat teachers and ask what they think about this and why this was translated into percentile instead of a confidence interval. what is it called, confidence level. And so, yeah, so we will, but the intent of the question apparently was the percentile. So you know how percentile works. Like, so it's a good review for percentile versus the interval, like confidence level, because percentile just means that you have that many percent of the population below your value. So yeah, if it was 99th percentile, the solution that they have it as an answer key makes sense. But yeah, I wouldn't have read it that way either. So let me get back to you about this after I consult some of the other AP Stat teachers. And that's it for this question.